basis for this kind of government. Well, we claim that we need, that there is enough consensus to be able to control, or, well, there is enough a general consensus to control the government, and at least decide how we should decide this. And well, I'm just not at all certain about that. It's quite an empirical claim, of course. You could give arguments that it's logically necessary for us to have some consensus in order to even discuss. But there does not have to be a lot of consensus at all. All we have to do is to understand. We need to speak the same language. We need to sort of have some basic understanding of each other's words. But even if, say, two people agree on the thing being relevant, one person could claim it being negatively relevant and the other positively. It might not be, well, even if we have the same considerations, we'll see how that kind of, how enough consensus could be just from a discussion, because, well, it's especially not in a really large ensemble, but even if you just get two people, you cannot, I'm not sure that you could even take one decision on behalf of those two people, that you could guarantee that. So I was just wondering, what are your grounds for supposing that it should be enough, and that especially there should be enough consensus about what procedures for making decisions are okay?
Okay. The one thing that I strongly disagree with, that what you said, but I mean, the whole model will fall apart, if that's correct, is when you said that one and the same consideration may be given negative valence by some people and given positive valence by the other. Now, my supposition, and of course it's arguable, my supposition is that when people start talking with one another, of course they may just go straight into the ground. They may have literally nothing to say. I mean, as in, I'm for this and you're for that, you know. There's no common ground they can find. There's no argument that can put forward on either side, such that the other recognizes that at least that's a relevant argument, right? Even if they haven't moved by it. If they did go into the straight, as well as the thing failed at first pass like that, then of course the second wouldn't be any common considerations valorized. My assumption is that so long as the discourse is continuing, the conversation is going on, they are finding at least arguments they can put to one another. And so far as that's true, they must be finding considerations that they can each recognize as at least relevant, though they may give them different weight. That's not consistent with thinking that, you know, some might say, well, that will help our society, let's suppose, look after the poor, that some would think that's a count against, and some would think it's a count for. I'm assuming that, of course, that may be true of some considerations, but I'm assuming that for a batch of considerations, they will at least all give positive valence and all give negative valence, the same power to those considerations, even if they give them different weight. So that's the one point where we disagree, that I am committed to that, and we can talk about that if you like. But then the other aspect of it, suppose I'm right about that, because you were also suggesting this, won't the considerations that are valorized or licensed, authorized, if you like, in that way amongst us, as precipitates and presuppositions of our discourse, won't they be, as it were, too loose as constraints on what government should do? Now, I think they're certainly not absolutely constraining. My picture was, if you remember, that for any given policy issue, there's a whole range of candidates, policies, that these considerations will strike out some policies, they'll leave others in position, and then with respect to deciding between these, there will be different procedures, P1, P2, P3, P4, for deciding that, right? And again, the considerations will strike out some of those. Maybe just a toss of a coin between these two that are left in place. So I grant you, that leaves slack in the system. It means that a government can legitimately claim to be speaking for us as a public, even though what it is saying is something that I don't agree with. Maybe a whole lot of people here don't agree, but a whole lot of people in the population don't agree with. That's just the way it is, I would say. That's the best we can get. But I think it's actually not bad, to tell the truth, because we all need a distinction between constitutional government, if you like, well, let me use the word legitimate government, and just government, or optimistic government, whatever you call it. Now, the theory of democracy, all it will give you is what I called earlier the perspective of constitutional political theory. All it gives you are the constraints such that they're fulfilled, at least government is legitimate. Now, what that means operationally is that people within the system can recognize it as speaking with the voice of the public. Right? But of course, we can recognize a government as speaking with the voice of the public and still think that what it's doing is wrong or unjust. Right? That's another level of argument. That's what I call participatory political intervention or philosophy or argument, if you like, where we within the system say, okay, we're agreeing that democracy is, and I agree we're doing things democratically, that's fine, I have no complaint as it were on a constitutional point. I have no complaint of the sort of saying that this is not being done legitimately. But I insist on continuing to argue and hold on to my point of view that what's being done is still wrong. Right? And that's an argument with my fellow citizens. And a lot of political philosophy, I think, is like that. You know, it's intra-systemic argument. So my image of democracy, it's true, government to be democratic may fall well short of being what by my lights or you lights or somebody else's lights, may fall well short of being a just or a good government and still be democratic and still may claim to speak for us. That's a part of the model, I agree. I just have to love it.
Well, I would like to return over to the idea of the editor. And I've understood you correctly as a kind of span here. So there's very active control, and then there is this somewhat more lazy editor that looks through the paper and doesn't use his red pen. Would you think that would there be a need for even a more fine-grained distinction, so that you had a kind of editor on vacation? A kind of hypothetical editor, one that didn't even read it. Would you go as far as to say that this kind of control is also consistent with your...
Well, it's interesting.
Well, if not, I think you should.
Well, okay, so people, what's happening is this, we've got 3 levels, really, I would say. Am I allowed to move around? I don't know. Yeah. We've got 3 levels. You've got, as it were, active, let's say, consent. As a citizen, or as an editor, you actively consent to this piece going through, right? Another is you virtually consent to it going through. And the third is you hypothetically consent to it going through. Now let's think about those for just a minute. When you actively consent, that means you, that's what you actually go through it with the red pen. And maybe you don't make changes, maybe you make some changes, but you know, this way it is okay, I've actively consented to it. Okay, let's say this way you maybe do make some marks with the red pen. The other case is you read through it, not a mark on the sheet, right? But you could have put a mark on the sheet if you wished to. So you're virtually consenting. So someone can come to you and say, how could you have published that piece? You can't say, I didn't write it, right? Because you did something which is just as powerful as writing it. You let it through. So you did have virtual control in that sense. Now suppose someone says, you were on vacation, you were sick, no one consulted you and it's published. And someone says, how could you publish this? Do you really take responsibility for this? Are you responsible for this? Now you might say, well actually, I have to tell you I'm not responsible for it. I didn't actually go through it, and it wasn't even the case that I passed it, so to speak. But I have to tell you something though. It's true that I would have thought it was okay, hypothetically, had I had the opportunity. Now that's a different thing, isn't it? When you say, I would have approved of it, you're not actually taking responsibility for it. You can't be blamed for it, right? By someone who thinks it's the wrong sort of thing. But it's a different sort of thing. It's not taking responsibility, but it's saying, as a matter of fact, I would have approved, but I'm not the person who should be looking to and asking, why was this published?
I'm not sure I would really draw the distinction exactly like that. I mean, most of the decisions in a democracy, I will never hear about them, I will never read about them, I will never even see the effect of them. So in this sense, I'm a kind of strange editor. I'm not checking them at all. But there is a kind I could if I wanted to.
Oh yeah, I think of that more on the virtual model, you see. So here we are, let's suppose we live in a society where there's a great deal of trust in what government is doing. In particular, this trust in what government is doing, not because we think that they're, wonderful human beings particularly, and any better than the rest of us, but because we know there are all those social movements out there that are watching what they're doing, and we trust them, or if we don't trust them individually, we trust, as it were, the net effect of all those different groups watching what's happening. We sort of believe that, look, if anything was going seriously in this, in the sense that it was not really by my sorts of lights, the sort of thing that was for the benefit of this society or answer to our common values, then I'd have heard about it, right? I would think of that as virtual control. You're still in the standby mode, This is the chair.
So we start. I'm sorry if I don't
There's somebody here as well.
Yeah. So perhaps we should start with you. Yeah.
I think we are in charge much more about what type of government we have, because we create our own lives by our minds, our words, and our actings. And I'm nervous. But we don't really know how we do it. It's about energy, and what you give energy, you get more of. So therefore you can't fight anything if you want to change it. It must go via acceptance, as prostitution. Yeah, for instance, and drugs and so on. You can't fight it because it must come up from here. And what you give energy, you get more of. So if you see the German people during the Second World War, the hate from them to the Jewish people made it possible for Hitler to come in the lead. And that's rather obvious. But what about the Buddhists? What about China occupying Tibet? Yeah, according to Dalai Lama, they are fighting the negative feelings daily. So
within Tibet.
Yeah. Those people, the Buddhists living in Tibet, they are fighting their negative feelings daily.
Yeah.
So from my point of view, the occupation from China in Tibet is only a manifestation in the physical of their own fights against themselves. Do you understand me? The negative feeling. So what you give energy, you get more of. And the tricky part is, if you suppress the feeling, if you just ignore it, and if you talk it out of you, I did my very best, it wasn't my fault, or if you blame someone else, you give it more energy than if you just feel the feelings and accept it, and it will go away. So people can continue year after year, sometimes lifetime, to suppress the feeling or blaming others, and giving it a lot of energy without knowing it. And from my point of view, again, the environment and the people inside it is only a mirror of your inner life and what you give energy. So therefore, my conclusion is that even a dictatorship is a kind of democracy, because in a country it is the total sum of the development from each individual that rules.
Well, it's a very, I don't agree, I think. It sounds like it's, but the trouble is, doesn't it sound like, as you said at the end, I mean, even a dictatorship can be a sort of democracy.
And just what Tony said, people in the dictatorship if they are have accepted everything inside them
Yeah.
and don't give energy to negative feelings, they can be non-effective of the bad things. They don't have to be affected and affected of some things that occur in the country.
Well, let me put a contrary point of view. Suppose you've got a population in which people are indeed very discomfortable with the government they have. Make it easy. Let it be an Eastern Bloc country in Europe in the mid-1980s. Two possibilities. In one country, nobody talks about it, but everybody feels bad. They keep this negative feeling, all right, but they don't vent it. They don't share it. The other possibility, they do share it, though they share it carefully, right? Not as it were, whether have you ever heard the public will get into trouble, but they share it amongst themselves, and they build up, as it were, little networks of opinion and shared opinion, so that it comes to be a matter of shared knowledge amongst them that we can't stand this government, right? Now, I think by doing that, and also shared views as to what's wrong with this government, or what they want, or where they've got genuine complaints, so long as they do that, there's then, so to speak, there's a real shared life of protest, which may not, because there may not be the opportunity, may not be to the overthrow of the government, but it builds up the sort of head of steam, if you like, you know, I would say the public energy, that can mean there, come the first opportunity, you know, everyone knows they can rely on others to join them in the demonstration as soon as there are even a small number starting to gather. That couldn't happen if no one said anything, if they all bottled it up. So I'm all for voicing and sharing, you know, rather than bottling up model.
But it's a big difference between being affected personally or just, you know, this we don't want to have. And then you can start talking and so on. But if you are affected personally,
Yeah.
you need to just feel it, because you can't take the boat into the country, to the land, if you don't accept that you're sitting in a boat in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah.
You must accept the previous situation for now, if you want to change something.
Well, you take Tibet nowadays, I mean, I don't know what it's like there, I don't have the experience, but I would have thought that if people are not talking to one another about, supposing it is the case, as I assume to be the case, if they're not talking to one another about how much they detest the rule under which they live, then, you know, eventually people can get to be not sure about what others think. They may think they're a lone dissident. I mean, that's the whole point about 1984 and those Brave New World and so on. In all of those cases with someone, you know, who thought he was unusual, you know, who thought he was the only one, because no one was speaking. Now, that's what's really important, I think. It's a wonderful novel, actually, not a novel, a history, I suppose you call it, quasi-biography by Wan Cha, called Wild Swans, which is the history of her grandmother and her mother and she herself in China in the 20th century. And it's a wonderful study, as she describes it, as to how, because all that was said in public was that Mao was, you know, the greatest human being that ever lived, the leader of the revolution, etc., etc. And she says how, to the very end, you know, even in the midst of the worst excesses of the Cultural Revolution, she found herself unable not to think that thought, and certainly unable to think that anybody else thought he was less than that. You know, by virtue of that had been what was outed, you know, that was what the public, as were level of awareness was, that this is the great God, Mao, so that it's precisely because there hadn't been any talk, so to speak, of a disciplined kind. Anyhow, we could go on a long time.
I'm sorry, we have no time for that because we have more questions. So Inga.
Yeah, so you painted a very, you know, beautiful description of this democratic form. But to me, it has a huge shortcoming of all these kinds of pictures that you you know, describe what you realize is that it's a very detailed goal description, and you know how to get there, so you know the technique, but you can't really implement it, because when you do it, you realize that, well, man is not really ready for this paradise yet. And so what this means is that if you want to initiate some kind of governmental form, you always have to deal with a practice which is already there. And you bring up constitutive rules and also regulative edition, editing or whatever. And you have a very sort of positive understanding of what these two forms of control will achieve. But it seems to me that the regulative editing, it's like regulative rules, they always regulate something that is ongoing. So what they actually do is that they look to the past to regulate what is present. And they can't really be anticipatory the way we describe them. And then we have, in contrast, the constitutive rules, which again are some kind of ideal case. So they sort of look to the present, but the rules which are constituted, they describe the future. So I don't see, how to really, realize this dream.
I guess I see, so there are two sources of pessimism you mentioned, one only in passing. One is pessimism as well about human nature, and the other is pessimism about where we are now. There's that nice Irish joke, the Irish farmer is asked by the tourist, pulls up the car, rolls down the window, and says to the local farmers on the roadside, he says, "How do I get from here to Galway?" And the farmer thinks, he looks and he said, "Well," he said, "if I was going to Galway, I wouldn't start from here." Okay, so one source of pessimism might be that that's a lovely place to get to, but we never get to it from where we are actually at, where we are now. That's why, and that's a straight challenge to what I hope, on the contrary, is true, but that's why I was interested in getting a model of government, of democracy in particular, the system, which bears some, however distant, similarity to where we are actually at, so that you can see, well, yeah, a lot of democracy, well, it is very striking. I mean, most of the places we call democracies, are countries in which there are elections, periodic elections. They claim to be open, and they claim to be fair. So there's at least a lip service given to having that sort of authorizing role. Many of them allow for even some sorts of referenda. On the other side, on the editorial side, most of the systems we describe as democracy do have an independence of the judiciary, for example. So there's at least that first prerequisite of editorial control through the courts by the people. They usually have a two-party system with an opposition in Parliament. And so what I'm describing is certainly it's well out from there, but it's in continuity with there. Actually, there's almost something slightly Hegelian about it, isn't there? I mean, it's sort of finding a sort of form or pattern that I think is implicit in where we are now. Of course, you can see a whole lot of different patterns in any, that the other models see different patterns. I'm saying this is a pattern we see there that's implicit, that we can certainly improve as we improve these various instruments of government, and it represents something that would deserve to be called democracy. That's my claim. Now, the other source of pessimism about human nature, I think, as I said the last day, and I know I said that I would address it in today's lecture, but as you can see, the material was just too much for me to cover, is the issue of, what I said was we should all accept something close to Hume's principle. I don't actually think we should accept exactly that principle, but Hume's principle was what I call the knave's principle. Mandeville actually had it prior to Hume. And that principle has it that we should design institutions so that they'll be capable of surviving, even should people in power prove to be knaves, even if their virtue should fail. Now, I don't quite endorse it, let me just say for the record, in that form, but a principle like that is certainly one that I do endorse in institutional design. So in all of these designs, that's why I've constantly been stressing the editorial thing, that you get various bodies watching other bodies, so you can get a sort of something like an equilibrium, that you can expect something like an equilibrium in which you get the goods you're looking for. I mean, that after all has been the whole idea of the mixed constitution in the Republican tradition. That's already there in Machiavelli and in the Romans. And really what I'm looking for is some development of that way of thinking. What I'm afraid of, maybe I should have said that at some stage. What I'm really afraid of is this, is that people will go with William Riker's model. Now, William Riker basically says, what do we mean by democracy? We just mean elections. But of course, elections are not enough. Populism, we call it. It's not going to be enough to run a decent government, so we also need something else, called a constitutionalism. And basically, we've got the power of the people on the one hand, and then we've got all these safeguards which we sensible liberals know about putting in place. Now, if you run with that model, given the currency of democracy, first of all, democracy isn't going to even be an ideal under that picture. That was the point of my first lecture in a way. But secondly, given the fact that democracy is the one value we all pay lip service to, you can easily see it getting taken up and used in justification of wholly populist regimes that breach constitutional constraints, because people can now say, well, who are these 9 judges, for example, to say what we people, if you think of the people electorally or think of them as just whatever our representatives say, you get that move towards populism, which I think is probably the most salient threat to democracies as we know it at the moment, is that that's the way they will drift. And what I would want to do is to fold into the notion of democracy, partly for these strategic reasons, but also because I think it's conceptually more, as we're integrated, fold into the notion of democracy these 2 elements, this pincer movement of authorial control and editorial control, built around this notion of the public ruling itself. That's the idea.
Now, you see the proponent wants desperately, I think, to get into contact with you. But you had
a very short question,
very short, and your answer.
Yes, sir.
A very short question to go back to essentials. You talk about a constitutional court as being essential for a democracy.
Yeah.
But what about the United States Supreme Court? If somebody packs it with their own judges, who's going to control that?
I think I am coming to the view that judicial review in the American model, which is not just the American model, but it's a model all over the world now, that judicial review, which involves judges appointed to a court, where the court only hears cases that are brought by individuals in the public after the law has been passed, and only those that have gone through other courts and so on have been appealed on. I think that that model is probably not the best model, certainly, of constitutional review. I think there are much better ways in which it could be done. Let me put that on the table. I think the American system, if there's a justification for it, the best offered is offered by Chris Eisgruber, a colleague of mine, as it happens, a lawyer, in a recent book on democracy, in which he argues that actually the election of judges to the Supreme Court, given it's a court at a high appellate level, where black letter law has run out, where really we're talking about the values of our society, that it's actually quite a good idea to have them elected by Parliament, representing them in a more politicized form than elsewhere, different bodies of opinion. But the trouble is, that will work only if you really don't get the court stacked. And that's a terrible problem. So I think it's ludicrous to break the filibuster. That's the one hope we have of guarding against it. Particularly when the head of the Senate, the majority leader, says democracy requires, numbers require, majoritarianism require that we do it in 50-50 basis. Given the Senate, as you know, is manned by 2 senators from each state, including 2 from Montana and 2 from the state of New York. In fact, if you want to do it in terms of red-blue states, the majority is very, very, very much with the Democratic senators, not with the Republican senators. That was actually pointed out by Ronnie Dworkin, I should say. It's not my own observation, but it's an interesting point against absolutely against stacking the good law.
Could go on for 5 or 6 days, and you have to do that next time. Until then, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have additional very important persons.
Can I bring you
here?
to America?
Yes, of course. And we have I would say, the designer of the Pufendorf lectures, Ylva. And we have Lund, of course. But the photographer's eyes are not there.
And one to you, surely.
Yes. Now, there will be photographs taken outside, and many of us meet at Pufendorf in a very short while. So, well, it's 20 past.
20
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Thank you all very much.
Ja,